Morgan Powers proudly presents a film by Morgan Powers, starring Morgan Powers, directed by Morgan Powers, written by Morgan Powers, edited by Morgan Powers, and featuring the many talents of Morgan Powers.
All right, class, and the quickly code is 9430. Good morning, Morgan, you're late. Hon, could you please turn on your microphone? I can't hear you. No, that's your camera, hon. Your microphone. All right. All jokes aside, I am here to give a presentation today. I'm here to get a good grade, don't you know? There's nothing in here. Joke's on you. What's up, guys? My name is Morgan Powers, and welcome to my final Music, History, and Literature 2 expose, entitled Classical Music Isn't Dead! Well, obviously, that's why we're all here. But what I found the most fascinating while we're studying a chronological timeline of music is how music evolves with the preference of the connoisseur. I'll give you an example. We all know and love the national anthem. Of course, we all read the Bible, the book of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Blasphemy! Oh! Not my Christian university. Hypocrite! You cuddle up with your baby Yoda doll every night. But politics aside, I think we can all agree this is an absolute classic. I know for myself personally, this was the one thing that my students would respond to. They wouldn't respond to focus box, they wouldn't respond to the quiet sign. What they responded to was dun 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 dun. You could teach them intervals, you could teach them rhythm, you could teach them anything if you just taught them Star Wars. Well, John Williams wasn't born yesterday. He didn't come out of a vacuum. Obviously, he had preferences and musical influences to draw from, preceding him. Yet the time periods that Star Wars is influenced by are considered antiquated or irrelevant. So the question remains, what parts of his musical composition, drawn from classical or romantic periods, are still relevant to the modern connoisseur today? That's what I'm here to talk with you about. We're going to be looking at 4 different composers: Tchaikovsky, Wagner, Holst, and Beethoven to answer this question. But before we continue, some credits. This production was made possible by TikTok Video Editor and Zoom. Now, to get back to the million-dollar question we were asking at the very beginning, what are the aspects of classical or romantic music known to be irrelevant or antiquated that have survived and thrived in 21st century music, as we see here in John Williams's compositions? And further, what makes John Williams such a good composer? John Williams actually carries 2 of the most important qualities, in my opinion, of a great composer that he shares with his older influences: innovation and integration. Instead of just being antiquated or irrelevant himself, John Williams is actually keeping up with the old musical tradition of listening to the connoisseur and really catering to their taste. I don't talk about it much in this particular presentation, but John Williams does use elements of jazz, flirtations of jazz, if you will, in his music, which is more or less modern. How could you not rock out to bops like this? John Williams is also an integrator of the arts. He uses things like an expanded orchestra and even implements the choir, where had that not been the case, obviously he's not the first composer to use a choir, but had he not kept up that tradition, choir could be just relegated, ostracized to church use exclusively, or possibly even be an endangered art. That's what carrying on musical traditions is as a composer. He's not only coming to the connoisseur's taste and really marketing to them, he's actually integrating and bringing in elements of the past in order to engage us still. So elements from periods like the classical period or the romantic period, as antiquated or irrelevant as people may smear them to be, are really not. They exist in modern cinematic music. So this might be a good time to distinguish between a very similar term used by Franz Schubert, a different composer, idée fixe. Idée fixe is a fixed idea, as the name would imply in the original language that it's been used in, or an obsession. So an idea fixe is a very psychological sort of term. It's supposed to bring up an emotion. It's not just a musical theme or motif in the sense of it just serves as a function. A leitmotif, on the other hand, is sort of the character's theme song as we know it today, or it announces the character's coming or highlights some sort of characteristic about somebody in a play, an object, a place, anything like that. For example, you have Darth Vader, who is announced oftentimes with percussion and a very heavy horn section. This is the antagonist. This is a very dark character. It's very militant, yet very triumphant. You know it's him when you hear the song. Then you've got Han and Leia on the other hand. There's a lot of tension, but there's a lot of violins and there's a lot of woodwinds, and it's just very, very beautiful. So you know that's not Darth Vader. Then there's Luke Skywalker and the Force. Also the horn section, but a very different kind of melody. It's distinct, it's hopeful, and there's a tension to kind of climb up into that triumphant section of the music. And next up we've got Richard Wagner. Wagner's got leitmotifs all over the place. Take a look at the ring cycle at section 10, the Renunciation of Love, and see how parallel it is to a section like Across the Stars in the prequels of the Star Wars saga. Not only does it actually start on the same tone, in E flat, these two pieces, Across the Stars and Renunciation of Love, share the same kind of building up tension, not really resolving it, and yet it's very hopeful. You can see the parallels between Tristan and Isolde and Anakin and Padme. This is really interesting. Star Wars has its roots in opera. Coincidence? I think not. You find a very elegant, a very drawn out kind of composition. It's very beautiful, despite the fact that there's a dying bird on stage. In Pyotr Tchaikovsky's The Dying Swan, which comes at the very end of the ballet, The Swan Lake, and yet despite all this beauty being drawn out, you never quite resolve until the very, very end. Tchaikovsky really makes you wait for it. It's the same thing with Han Solo and the Princess. There's a lot of tension that's built up. If you look at the suite where it comes in and out of the storyline, you'll find that it's often pinned up against really obtuse bass lines that are kind of competing with it. Cinematically, this is really interesting to look at. These are usually found in scenes of extreme conflict where, spoiler alert, Han Solo is gonna get frozen in carbonite. And you've got this beautiful melody on top that's fighting to stay on top, and it's just like really warring and it's dissonant, and you're like, oh my gosh, my heart's being torn in two. Eventually, it resolves. Obviously not in the way we wanted to. Again, if you haven't seen Star Wars at this point, are you really living? Of all the composers and compositions named today, this one is probably the most obvious influence of John Williams. This would be Gustav Holst, the composer of the Planet's Suite. We'll be looking at his first movement, Mars, the Bringer of War. If you take a listen, it sounds a little too much like Star Wars. That's because there are 3 different elements that John Williams uses in his respective Imperial March and in Star Wars main theme: bitonality, tritone, and ostinato. Quick definition. An ostinato is a continually repeated phrase or rhythm. It's very in your face, especially if it's timpani, and you'll find a lot of that in John Williams excerpts, and you'll find it paralleled in Holst's excerpts. This is why I need to go to college. Then you've got bitonality. Bitonality is a triad, usually in the upper hand, with a non-chord tone in the lower hand, and they're synthesized. It gives it a lot of color, it can give it dissonance, and we all know what tritone is. Devil's interval. You have a real sense of oomph and color and sort of musical ambiguity in this ominous feeling that you would imagine if you're in space, on top of the major polyphony that goes on in these 2 pieces. And last but not least, Ludwig van Beethoven. Namely, we're going to talk about his 3rd symphony, Eroica. Translated, this means heroism. Beethoven's trademark characteristic of his early work is the triumphant, relieving of musical tension, if you will. Beethoven was also living in the same time era that Napoleon Bonaparte was. Actually, this symphony is dedicated to him. Historically, this is very interesting. But what does that have to do with Star Wars? Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to be remembered as a conquering hero, as you see him here on his horse, and Beethoven composed Eroica in remembrance of that conquest. The Star Wars saga deals with the same themes of conquest, so it would only be appropriate for John Williams to use influences like these in his compositions. That's it! We've covered all 4 of those musical composers today. So that's my spiel. Classical music isn't dead. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I enjoyed learning about it. It was fun. To wrap it all up, I'll just say, great working with you, and may the force be with you. Oh.